All right, so we are going to talk about garden soils. And I would have to say this is one of the most mystifying, confusing things to people is soil. I mean, everybody knows they want good soil, but how do you get good soil? What makes a good soil? When is soil causing problems? There's just lots of questions people have about soil. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, everyone wants good soil, and good soil is the foundation for a productive garden. So the goal is to try and grow food or growing your crops. And so in order to do that, you want to have some good soil. And the big question is, what does that mean? So here's a list of characteristics of a good soil, and we will talk about each of these during today's presentation. So probably the big one at the top there is the high level of organic matter, and we'll talk more about what that means, but that means briefly how much organic matter is in your soil, but also adequate levels of plant nutrients, which is different than organic matter. pH, a suitable pH range for your soil is very important. And then, of course, adequate depth, how deep is your soil, and good soil structure. So good drainage is the other one, relates to soil structure, and then freedom from toxic materials. And then lastly, we're talking about freedom from weed seeds and aggressive perennials, etc. But all of these we'll talk about more in detail as we work through our presentation today. All right, organic matter. This is probably the number one thing that affects whether or not you have good soil and how well your plants will grow. So sometimes I like to just say it's all about organic matter. So the most important thing you can do to improve your soil is add organic matter. And so there's a lot of confusion on what organic matter is. Basically, it's any kind of plant material, could be also animal material, of something that was once alive at some point that you add to your soil. So we'll talk a little bit more about specific types of organic matter here in a minute, but just to be aware, organic matter is constantly decomposing. It's breaking down as it becomes part of your soil. And we need to continually add. It's not just a one-time deal, because as it decomposes, it it shrinks and becomes less and less. And so you're going to need to keep adding organic matter if you want to keep your soil in good condition. The benefits are many. So if you add organic matter to your soil, all these things will happen here. So you'll increase the water holding capacity, which means your soil will be able to hold more water. Think of like a sponge helps hold water. Organic matter helps hold the water so your soil won't dry out too quickly. And this is especially important in the heat of summer when it's really hot, we're not getting much rain. If you have more organic matter, you will need to water less often. The other one that's a little bit harder to understand is organic matter will increase the pore space. And we're talking about the little soil pores, the little spaces in between your soil particles. And it's important to have pore space because that is where oxygen is and also water will be. And in clay, the pore space is very, very tiny. And so because the particles are tiny, so in clay soils, there's not much pore space. So the water, doesn't drain out quickly, but also there's not much room for air in there. Sand, on the other hand, has big particles, and so water drains out too quickly. But organic matter will solve all these problems and just make sure that you have proper pore space size. The other thing organic matter does is increases the nutrient holding capacity. Your soil can hold more nutrients if it has lots of organic matter. If it's very low in organic matter, it can't hold as much nutrients. Specifically, think like sand has almost no nutrients in it at all. The other thing is it will increase the soil microbial activity and the chemical reactions in the soil because all that happens in the presence of organic matter. In heavy clay soils or very sandy soils, there are just not a lot of soil microbes that can survive in those kind of conditions. And soil microbes just really do all kinds of wonderful things to help your plants grow. And then finally, just on a practical standpoint, if you have lots of organic matter, It will make the soil softer and crumbles nicer, and the texture is much nicer for just working. It's not hard, and for tilling and raking and hoeing and all those operations, it's a whole lot easier to do if there's lots of organic matter because your soil will be softer. All right. Yet another characteristic of good soil is the level of plant nutrients. There's three main nutrients. They're called the macronutrients that are essential for plant growth, and nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There you can see the scientific symbols for those, if you remember that from science class. Those are the three main nutrients. And when you see a fertilizer like this bag right here, you're going to see three numbers typically. And those numbers represent a percentage of these three chemicals in that order. So 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% of potassium. And again, those are the major nutrients. There's some other slightly major nutrients would be like calcium and sulfur and magnesium, but they generally are not necessarily included in these kinds of fertilizers, and you need those. You might have to add something special. But then there's also another whole group of nutrients that are required, and they're present in every soil pretty much. And these are called micronutrients. So there's not very large amounts of these nutrients, but still they're important. Kind of like certain vitamins are more important for human health, but you don't need them in large quantity. But iron, boron, manganese, zinc, copper, chlorine, and molybdenum. So these are nutrients we don't even often happen to think about, just because if you're adding organic matter, they're going to be present. In any good topsoil, they will be present. So you generally do not have to worry about trying to add these nutrients. So just a little bit about fertilizer. The definition of fertilizer is basically a material that you add to the soil that will provide these essential plant nutrients. And it's important to note that if it's a commercial fertilizer, as opposed to just like manure or something, that you might get from a farmer, commercial fertilizer has to list these percentages and the ingredients. So it's got to tell what's in it, and it's got to show these percentage ingredients, because that lets you know how strong the fertilizer is, and will let you know how much you need to add. And a lot of people get confused on compost versus fertilizer because they think that basically compost might be the same as fertilizer. And if you add compost, you don't need to add fertilizer or things like that. But here's a little bit of explanation on that. So again, fertilizer, the main purpose is to add nutrients, whereas compost, the main purpose is to add organic matter. In fertilizer, the nutrients are going to be more concentrated. In compost, the nutrients are not very concentrated. In fact, typically in compost, there's not enough nutrients to meet all your plant needs, so you still need to add fertilizer. It will have some nutrients. It will depend on the kind of compost. And if you add a lot of compost every year, you may not need very much fertilizer, but you still may need some. The other thing about fertilizers is, sometimes they can be made from organic materials. Other times they're chemical materials, and they're very different. Usually the chemical fertilizers are very concentrated, and it's real easy to overdo it. Compost, on the other hand, is 100% organic matter, and it may have, as I mentioned, a lot of nutrients or little nutrients or somewhere in between. It's also to notice that too much fertilizer can definitely harm your plants, and that's real easy to overdo. Sometimes people will put like a whole handful of fertilizer in the planting hole when they're planting a tomato plant, and that usually will kill the tomato plant. But even just putting out too much fertilizer, it's easy to think that more is better, but it's not. You want to follow the instructions and put just the amount they tell you to. Compost, on the other hand, you're not likely to add too much compost to your garden. If you added a whole truckload to your garden, that would not necessarily be a bad thing to help your garden to grow much better. So when you're fertilizing your soil, as far as figuring out how much to do, if you've done a soil test, you're going to follow the directions on your soil test because it will give you some specific directions. But if you don't have a soil test, you can just do a general amount, like the organic fertilizer that we have. It's a chicken manure-based fertilizer. If you add 2 pounds of that per 100 square feet, like twice a year, that should be adequate fertilizer for most garden conditions. And that's assuming your soil is just basically, a good topsoil. If you have really, really bad soil, you might need to add a little more. The thing with the organic fertilizer that we like is it's very slow release, so you're much less likely to put down too much and damage your plants. And if you don't have a good sense of what 100 square feet looks like, that would be, think of 10 feet by 10 feet. That would be 100 square feet. So your garden, if it was 20 by 30 square feet, that would be like 600 square feet. So obviously you need to multiply out how much fertilizer to add. So, all right, the other important characteristic of good soil is pH, that optimum pH range. And if you remember from science class, pH is the measurement of how acid or how alkaline the soil is. And there's a scale. Look down here, you can see the scale. And if it's high in alkaline or alkalinity, the numbers will be higher. If it's low, it will be acid and will be in the lower numbers. So the thing is about pH, why it's so important is it affects, whether or not the nutrients will actually be available to your plants. Because if your pH is too high or too low, nutrients won't be available. It also affects those soil microbes that we talked about. pH is too high or too low, the soil microbes will not thrive. And then just general plant growth because of both of those reasons. If your soil pH is too high or too low, plants will not grow well. They will not be healthy. So the scale is like from 0 to 14. 7 is in the middle, that's neutral. Anything above 7 is alkaline, anything below 7 is acid. Here in Kansas City, we tend to usually be kind of right at that neutral or a little on the alkaline side, like, somewhere between 7 and 7.4. Sometimes it's even 7.6, 7.8, and that's a little alkaline. That's not good. Because remember, the optimum range for vegetables is going to be between 6 and 7, so just a little below neutral. So just slightly acid is kind of the perfect range for vegetables. Now, if you're above it, just a little bit, like 7.1, 7.2, you can still grow vegetables. It's not a problem. But you want to keep your eye on that so it doesn't change. And you might want to think about adjusting your pH to be lower. And that is the question. So you may get this on your soil test, and we'll talk about this later. It might tell you that you need to change the pH and lower the pH. So, it's a good idea to get your soil tested. Typically around here in Kansas City, it's going to tell you to lower the pH, make it more acid. And the way that you do that is to add sulfur. And here's a material you can buy at the garden center. It's called soil sulfur, specifically for the purpose of adding to gardens. It comes in a powder form. The other thing that if you needed to raise your pH, and this is more typical in other parts of the country where they have acid soils, you would add limestone, or you could add wood ashes if you have like a fireplace or a wood stove to raise that pH level, and that will make it more alkaline. Generally, here in Kansas City, again, you don't need to add limestone. Many people will come from other parts of the country where they have to add lime every year to their soil. And so they just think if they add lime, that's a good thing. But that's not necessarily a good thing around here, and generally it would be a bad thing. So most likely to need sulfur. The other thing is you're going to add these materials in the fall because it takes time for it to, kind of affect the soil and, for the soil to really adapt to that new pH level. So especially if you're doing something like blueberries where you're wanting to change the soil and make it very acid, you definitely want to do this in the fall because it can't just happen overnight. And the other thing is you can't just sprinkle the stuff on top of the soil like the soil sulfur. You have to mix it in. So sprinkle it on top and then till it in because you want to get that soil sulfur down low to where the roots will be. All right, so we're still talking about characteristics of good soil. And one is that you just want the adequate depth. If your soil is not very deep, your plants won't have as much room to grow. So a good soil, generally, you're going to have at least 8 inches. 12 is better, but 8 is probably more normal around here. 8 inches of good soil. That's what we call topsoil because it's what's near the top. That's going to be the richest and have the highest organic matter. The soil down below is still important because roots will go down there. That's what we call the subsoil. Sometimes it's called the B horizon. This is the A horizon and the B horizon. So this is still soil, but lots of times this will have more clay in it. But if your soil is not very deep, let's say it's only 4 inches deep, and this happens sometimes, especially in new housing developments when they're building houses, they'll have bulldozers come in and they'll scrape away some of the topsoil and they won't put it all back. They'll just leave you with kind of a shallow layer of topsoil, like 4 inches. So then if you're going to make a garden, you might want to add some more soil. In fact, you definitely would want to add some more soil. And so you can do that just by adding soil to your little garden plot, or you could actually build some raised beds and fill them with soil. And I do get a lot of questions about purchasing soil for your garden plot or if you're going to make raised beds, because generally you're going to want some quantity. Unless you're just doing a very tiny raised bed, you're going to need to get some quantity. If you have just a tiny raised bed, you could probably go buy some soil in bags and that would work. But even just a single raised bed would take a large one, would take a lot of bags of material, and that gets very expensive. So you want to get soil in bulk. So when people want to buy topsoil, there's places you can buy it from, but I recommend not buying just straight topsoil. I recommend buying a mixture, a blend of topsoil and compost. That's what we use in all of our raised beds, at all of our community gardens, at schools. It's a mixture of half compost and half topsoil, and that's going to get you lots and lots of organic matter and make a really rich soil for you. It's important to purchase from a good company that has a good reputation for good soil. We have a company we really like, and I'll actually mention their name just because they've been really good to us and given us some really good soil, or sold us some really good soil. It's called KC Composting, and they're located out south, kind of out there beyond Belton, and they deliver all over the city. But again, you can buy it from other places. Other places make this mix too, of half compost, half topsoil. Sometimes the company will have like 20% compost and 80% topsoil, and I don't think that's as good because it doesn't get you as much organic matter. So I like the 50-50 mix. And when you're buying, you need to figure out how much you need for your project. Depends how big your garden is. But basically, you just have to use the formula where you take the length of the garden and the width of the garden and multiply that, and then multiply it by the depth of the garden. And if you have difficulty in doing this, you can actually just go to the internet and it'll tell you how to calculate soil volume. And it'll tell you how many cubic yards, because that's typically how they sell soil, by the cubic yard. And if you just need a little, maybe for one raised bed or something, or two, you can go get a pickup load or two. And that's still going to be a lot of work to shovel it. But that way you don't have to pay for a big dump truck full if you don't need that much. But on the other hand, there's times when you might need a dump truck full if you're doing several raised beds or you have a good sized garden and you want to add a lot of material. If you do get a dump truck load, you want to make sure they dump it as close to the garden as possible because it's a lot of work to move that soil. So either way, you're going to be in for some work, and you want to have lots of helpers if you're going to take on a big project like this. All right, so yet another characteristic of good soil is good soil structure. We talked a little bit about the pore space. Good soils have adequate pore space, and organic matter helps with that. Clay soils generally have terrible pore space because the particles are so tiny, and so the clay all sticks together. But soils with good soil structure, they will crumble easily. And it's important when you're tilling not to till the soil when it's wet, or it will ruin your soil structure. This happens all the time. People are really anxious to till their garden, and the soil's a little wet because it's been raining, and so they go out and till it, and it kind of turns the soil into mud balls, and it packs it together really tight, and it's really hard to break those mud balls apart later. You can do that over time, but it's not going to happen. It'll make it hard to plant little tiny seeds. especially if there's very much clay in the soil, it will just really, really ruin your soil structure. So never ever till when it's wet. Um, Tilling your garden soil can be hard, especially the first year if you've got sod. I would strongly recommend hiring it done, hiring a tilling contractor, especially someone maybe who has a small tractor who could come out and do that, because to break up that sod the first year is really hard. There's some ways you can do it at home without a tiller. If you have time, you can like smother out the grass by putting down cardboard or putting a heavy layer of mulch, like 6 or 8 inches the year before. If you do that, it will kill the grass and then make it easier for tilling the following year. But in any case, the first year is generally the hardest if you're tilling up sod. So the other thing is, it's so much easier to do when it's at that right soil moisture. If it's too wet, it's going to mess up your garden and make a big mess for you and just make it really difficult to grow in. I like to do fall spading or fall plowing to get your garden ready for the next year. And then you can either till it or rake it, whatever you want to do in the spring when it's time to plant your spring crops. Also, once you do till your soil, try and avoid walking on it as much as possible, especially in the area where you're going to plant your plants, because you run all this trouble of fluffing up the soil and getting nice pore space in there. And if you walk on it, especially right where you're going to plant things, it's going to squeeze out the soil and squeeze out those little air spaces and compact the soil and make it more difficult for plants to grow. All right, yet another characteristic of good soil is good drainage. And all that drainage means is the ability of the soil to carry away excess water. And that will be affected by, the type of soil particles, the size, is it clay, et cetera. And also, like, is it located in a depression where the water kind of collects? Here in this picture, you can see the water kind of collects in this area. Good soils should drain well. Basically, after 24 hours after a rain, you should not be able to see any water sitting on top of the ground. If you do see that, that's generally a sign that you have bad drainage, and you might need to either build raised beds or move to a different spot. And clay soils in particular drain very poorly. They just don't drain quickly. They hold water for a long time and stay soggy, which is not good for plants. If you're trying to figure out where to put your garden, you can do a drainage test by going out and digging a hole in the ground and dig it about 1 foot deep and maybe 1 foot wide and 1 foot long or whatever, and then make it have straight sides, and then fill the hole up with water from the garden hose. And then once you do that, just wait and see how long it takes for it to drain out. If it drains out quickly, that's a good sign. If it takes more than a day, that's a bad sign. And that means that your soil would not be a good site for a garden right there. And then I think lastly on our list of characteristics of good soil, we talk about freedom from toxic materials. Usually this is not going to be a problem in your backyard. And when I'm talking about toxic materials, I'm talking about industrial chemicals. So this would be if for some reason you're using an empty lot somewhere for a garden. Maybe there was some kind of industrial activity going on there, some chemical, things like dry cleaners or a gas station or something like that. The other thing is if it's like an old orchard that used to be a fruit orchard many, many years ago, they used to use lots of toxic chemicals and that could build up in your soil. So things like that. But generally, in your backyard, you're not going to have any problem with toxic materials unless you put something there. So the other thing is a good soil would be free from weed seeds, and that's in a perfect soil you'd have no weed seeds, but almost every soil you're going to have some weed seeds because weeds will sprout up. And then the problem is if you've had a garden where lots of weeds have been growing year after year and they haven't been stopped from growing, they will have dropped a lot of seeds, and that could affect it and make it difficult to grow your garden. But You can beat that usually. What's harder is to deal with aggressive perennial weeds. And this right here is something that's called Bermuda grass. And sometimes you'll see that in a lawn. And if you've got Bermuda grass, it's really difficult to deal with because it just spreads everywhere. And it spreads from these underground rhizomes. And just a little piece like this can spread and start taking off and take over a garden space real easily. But other perennial weeds, even things like dandelions, bindweed, these are all perennial weeds. Johnson grass that can be very difficult to deal with. Not impossible, but can make it difficult. So again, a good soil, you would not have these kinds of weeds in there. And a little bit about soil testing. You can obviously send your soil away to a lab to get tested, but you can also learn a lot about your soil just from looking at a shovelful. So I tell people, go out in your backyard if you're trying to figure out where to put your garden, turn over a shovelful and just see what the dirt looks like. Does it look like clay or does it look like topsoil? This soil here is darker, it's crumbling nicely, so that's obviously good topsoil. Clay, on the other hand, is generally sort of brownish or tan in color, sometimes gray, and it's very sticky and a whole lot different consistency. Generally, clay does not crumble very easily, and whereas like this topsoil, you can take it and take a handful, and you might have a clod of it, but if you crumble it up in your hand, it will just crumble. And that's just kind of a good indicator of what the soil is like. Excuse me. On the other hand, it can be really helpful to actually do a lab test. And this involves taking a soil sample. And the way that you do this is you want to take what's known as a representative soil sample, because if you just take it from one spot in your garden, that doesn't give you a good picture of what the whole garden is like. So what they recommend is taking several samples from different spots in your garden, even like 5 or 6 different places, and you take a shovel and see how he's cutting. This person is cutting a thin slice of soil there. So you're doing that just like the depth of one, shovelful, and then you'll take that shovelful and drop it in a bucket, and like a 5-gallon bucket or a wheelbarrow, and then do this in 5 or 6 different places from around your garden, and drop them all in the bucket or the wheelbarrow together and mix them all up, and that will give you a good representation of what your overall soil is like for your garden. And then you're going to send the soil off to a lab. The University Extension Services provide testing services for people who want to get their soil tested. So like University of Missouri, University of Kansas, you can get your soil tested. There's a fee that they charge. You have to send the soil into them or drop it in at their offices. Last time I checked, Missouri, it was like $12.50 for a soil test. And so they'll even have good instructions with you about how to do this sampling and how much soil to send and all that when you do that. So the other question would be is like how to interpret the soil results, the testing results when they come back to you. They'll send you something in the mail, or generally now it's by email. And what kinds of things are you looking for when you get those soil test results back? So we're going to look at that a little bit here on our next picture here. Here is a soil test report. Came from the University of Missouri. This person sent off their soil sample and they got this back. Usually it takes a few weeks. The other thing is if you do a soil test in the spring, everybody is wanting to do it all at the same time. So they're really busy in the spring, it can take longer. It's much better to do a soil test in the fall because they're not as busy. And then if you need to add something like sulfur, then you can add that, and it'll have time to take effect in the soil before you plant the next spring. So here's a close-up here, and we're going to look at some of this real quickly. So pH over here under soil test results, the pH in this soil is 7.6. So that is high. That's alkaline. Remember, We said 7 was neutral, and we said the optimum is 6.0 to 7.0. So this is kind of high, but that's not unusual. So definitely you would never want to add lime to the soil because that would make it worse. And you're going to need to add sulfur. So here you can see in their recommendations, see how the highlighted, they have sulfur highlighted, and they're saying 20 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And that would be something that, again, you'd want to add in the fall, ideally, or if it's springtime and you haven't planted yet, you could still add it, but you have to be able to till it in. So definitely want to do that in the fall if you can. So that's pH. That's the important thing you're going to be looking at first. And then we're going to look at the major nutrients, phosphorus and potassium. The thing that you'll find kind of curious is that it does not mention nitrogen here. And that is because nitrogen is very volatile. It goes in and out of the soil very easily. Like every time it rains, you have a heavy rain, it actually washes some of the nitrogen through the soil and it leaches it out. So the nitrogen is always changing, and you can't really measure that very easily, but it's always going to be changing. So it's better just to figure out how much nitrogen you're going to need to add for your soil each year just to replace the crops. And so generally you're just kind of guessing how much nitrogen to add and adding a fertilizer that has some nitrogen. But phosphorus and potassium are these other major nutrients. And you can see these numbers up here. The little stars tell you what level you're in. So like on phosphorus here, the level goes all the way up to very high. And so that means that's plenty. You don't need to add any. Even high or even medium, you wouldn't need to add any. So that's a good thing. The other problem is sometimes, especially here in our area, we see levels of nutrients that are too high. And so like, look at the potassium level here. It is way up here in the excess range, which means too high. So you do not really want to be adding a general fertilizer to this soil. The only kind of fertilizer you would want to add would be a nitrogen fertilizer just to replace the nitrogen. So, and then the other ones, the calcium and magnesium, they are, medium, so they're fine. Don't need to think about those. And then the other thing that really tells you a lot about your soil is this organic matter. Because remember, you're talking about how organic matter is so important to your soil. And if you have bad soil, to make it better, you want to add organic matter. This percentage of organic matter is very high. And so what I'm guessing here is that someone actually this is probably raised beds, and they probably ordered that level of compost and topsoil. It's a mix. And so that's why the organic matter level is so high. It's 23%. That is great. That's the best thing about this soil test right here. An average just garden soil, which has not had anything added to it, might be about 5%. And that's considered kind of the lower level for a good garden soil. So more than 5% is great. So if your soil is 5% or below, you're going to definitely want to add organic matter. Even if you're a little above 5%, you're going to want to keep adding organic matter at least maybe every other year so that your soil will stay rich. So that's the main parts to know about this soil test. There'll be some comments down here. Some of this has to do with herbicides. That doesn't really, affect your soil test here if you're not using herbicides. Says the soil should be tested every 2 or 3 years. That's kind of a good idea just to see how it's doing, because it'll change. You don't need to do it every year because it won't change that much in a single year. But here, down here in the highlighted part is the recommendation, where it tells you for this particular soil test what they are recommending. So it's saying the pH is too high for vegetables, because remember it's above that optimum level. Add 20 pounds of sulfur per 1,000 square feet, and they say at least 6 months prior to planting and you want to work it into the soil for it to be the most effective. So that's, again, just backing up what I was telling you earlier. All right, sometimes we get questions about testing for lead or toxic chemicals. And again, toxic chemicals shouldn't be an issue unless there was some kind of industrial activity there, and in which case you're probably better off just not gardening there. Because it's hard to test for toxic chemicals because they don't know what to test for unless you have something specific. But even then, it's a very expensive test. Lead, on the other hand, is something that a lot of gardeners worry about. It's generally not a problem here. Lead can come from different sources. Used to be when we had lead gasoline, there'd be a lot of lead coming from any major street, and if it was garden was nearby, the fumes from automobiles could actually drop lead into your soil. That's not a problem any longer. Right now, the most common source of lead would be from paint, from old construction. Many, many years ago, there used to be lead in paint. There's no longer lead in house paint, but old house paint. So like if you have an older house and you scraped off the old paint and it's right down in the soil, that could affect that soil right there. But, or if you had a house torn down on an empty lot, sometimes there would be lead there. We did a bunch of soil tests for lead many years ago, and the only place where we found a high level of lead was in that area I was talking about, right up next against the house, where they'd scrape the paint after painting. Every few years they would paint and scrape the paint off, and it would fall right down into the soil. So generally, you do not need to worry about testing for lead, but you can do that. It's an extra cost to do that, and you have to find a laboratory that's willing to do that, but they don't all do that. So if you did have high level of lead in your soil, you can sort of deal with it by growing different kinds of crops. If you grow leafy crops, they do take up the lead, and so you would be then ingesting that. But if you're growing fruiting crops, things like tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers, squash, the lead does not go into the fruit, it only goes into the leaves. And since you don't eat the leaves from those crops, it wouldn't be a problem. But generally, again, lead is not a problem here in our area. All right, so now we're going to talk about soil amendments and just definition of soil amendments. You'll hear this term in gardening books and gardening websites. Basically, that's just anything you're going to add to the soil to improve the condition, to make it better soil. And of course, that's going to make plants grow better. So generally, we're going to be talking about organic matter, but there's also some non-organic matter amendments. So you got to think about when you're wanting to know what to add to your soil to amend it, to make it better, what are you trying to accomplish? Generally, you're just trying to increase that organic matter level. But the other example we just talked about was, changing the pH, or adding, nutrients. If your soil was really low in nutrients, you'd be wanting to add some nutrients. Generally, that's not going to be as much of a problem, but the organic matter and the pH are more likely things you would need to deal with. So there's a million different products out there, soil amendments. Here's just a few pictures. Sometimes it's like, manure that comes in a bag, soil conditioner made from different organic stuff. Down here, here's our soil sulfur again. Here's some soil minerals that you can add to make the soil richer. So there's just many, many different kinds of soil amendments. Organic materials or non-organic materials. Generally, for soil amendments, you're wanting to add something organic because you want to add that organic matter. Again, some forms of organic matter have not very much nutrients in them. Some have a lot of nutrients. But the whole idea is here, you're going to improve that physical condition. If it's an organic material, if it's a chemical material like the sulfur, you're improving the chemical condition of the soil. And some soil amendments are things you buy, other ones you can get for free. Like if you have lots of leaves and you can turn them into compost, you can either add them, either composted or uncomposted, you can add them to your soil, and that will make your soil a lot more effective for plant growth. You'll improve the texture and all those good things we talked about earlier. So again, what kinds of soil amendments can you get? So obviously you can get compost. Leaves are good. Straw, if you use straw as your mulch, you can add that into your garden. Grass clippings, especially if you use them as a mulch, then you till them in at the end of the season. You can buy products like alfalfa meal or bone meal. These are all organic materials that you can add to your soil as an amendment. The one thing is, if you're going to do manure, you want to use manure that has been aged, whereas fresh manure is very strong and too high in nutrients, and you can actually burn your plants and kill them, and that's not good, obviously. But the compost and leaves are pretty easy to deal with and are very low cost. So if you're going to add very much, you do need to think about cost because it can be expensive. All right, so the non-organic soil amendments, again, we talked about lime. You're not generally going to do that here in Kansas City. Sulfur, rock phosphate if you need phosphorus. If you need potassium, which that other soil test did not, there's a mineral material you can buy called green sand. Ground granite is also a source of potassium, and this is all stuff you can buy in bags. Sand is also something that sometimes people will add to your soil. It does not add any nutrients. It mainly helps improve drainage if you have soil that doesn't drain very well. But really, a much better answer to the drainage thing is to add compost. Because if you improve the texture of your soil and the pore space, that will help the soil to drain much, much better. So generally, do not recommend purchasing a lot of sand to add to your soil. And as far as how to add the soil amendments, you're going to calculate how much you're going to add using different formulas. Like if you want to spread 3 inches of compost over your whole garden, you're going to take the width times the length times that depth, which is 3 inches, which is 1/4 of a square foot. And that will tell you how many cubic feet. You can compute that into cubic yards, and then you'll be ordering that. Generally, if you're buying something in a bag, it will come by cubic feet, and that will tell you how much you need. Basically, beyond that, you're going to use a wheelbarrow and spread it out as evenly as you can over the whole garden area, over the whole raised bed. And then you want to incorporate it into the soil. So tilling it lightly. If you are doing it in the fall, you can turn it over with a spade, but tilling is usually easier. So as far as recommended soil amendments, really, the most likely thing, unless you're just trying to change pH, is you're going to need to add organic matter. And the easiest way to do that is to purchase some bulk commercial compost or some compost in a bag. You can, of course, make your own compost, and it's a good idea to have your compost pile near your garden, but it's not going to produce enough organic matter, not enough compost to make a big difference in your garden. So if you need to improve your soil, I recommend getting bulk commercial compost from that, like the KC Composting Company, and go get a pickup load or get a dump truck load if you need that much, and then spread it out over your garden. If you don't need that much and you really just want to buy something in a bag, maybe just to add a little bit to your raised bed, I strongly recommend cotton burr compost, and that's a product that we sell here. You can also buy it at other locations. The big box stores and nurseries and garden centers will have it. And it's basically a byproduct of growing cotton, and it helps to enrich the soil and improves the texture of the soil. So if you're going to buy something in a bag, I recommend that over other products, just because I've seen it have really good results. So I do not recommend just going out and buying expensive products that are going to cost you a fortune for your garden. It doesn't have to be expensive. You can do it very affordably. And so again, the goal for your garden is to have healthy soil, so you'll be able to grow healthy plants and lots of food. So here's just a few things to remember before we get into our questions. Is that your soil was formed over thousands of years, and so it didn't happen fast. So it might take a while to get it in good shape, but you can start by adding a lot of organic matter in 1 year, and then maybe adding some more the next year if your soil's in really bad shape. It's also just one of the most worthwhile things you can do for your garden. You can spend lots of time doing all kinds of things for your garden, but building your soil, making healthy soil is probably one of the most important things to do for your garden, obviously. And then also, again, it's just not a one-time thing. Adding organic matter, sure, maybe the first time, the initial adding of organic matter is going to be the biggest, but you're going to keep adding it, maybe every couple of years, every 2 or 3 years, just because it will keep breaking down, and you want to keep your soil in good condition. So these are all the things that can help you with your soil. Again, if you have questions, you can email us at contact@kccg.org. Right now, we'll check and see if we have any questions that people would like to hear about.
Yes, I just got done compiling all of the questions. Hold on, I got one more. Okay, let me add this last one from Laura there. I am going to print it out now, and I will swing by your office, Ben. Give me 1 or 30 seconds here.
Sure, absolutely, no problem. Another problem I'll just mention that lots of times people run into in the spring is your soil is too wet to get out there and do some working. So I usually recommend to people try and get at least a portion of your garden tilled up, ready to go in the fall. And that will help have it get ready. In fact, if it's really wet, you can cover it up with a tarp if it looks like it's going to rain, and that will help. So those, if you can have just a little bit ready, then you can plant some of your early spring stuff when we're getting lots of rain. And then later on, it'll dry out and you can plant your warm season stuff. All right, so now we're going to look at our questions. Let me see if I can stop sharing here. All right, so what can you do with your soil if it's already alkaline and your vegetables are already planted? And that's a really good question, because obviously you're not going to till it up and add sulfur right now. So generally, unless you had just really bad results in the past, I would just wait for a year. The plants will grow okay, unless it's really, really high, but you would have probably noticed this and your plants would already be suffering. So you can just wait till fall. If you have some plants in particular that maybe need a little more acid soil, like blueberries or something, you could actually add a little vinegar to your soil, and just, a straight, regular kitchen type vinegar. You could do that and just sprinkle some in a sprinkling can over your garden bed. Try not to get it on the leaves, because it could be a little hard on the leaves. But generally, I would just wait till the following fall and do that. So, raised beds. Question about raised beds. Do you need testing for that? Generally, if you've already built a raised bed and you purchased some good soil, you probably can go longer without needing a test. Because generally, if you got that 50-50 mix, your soil should be good for quite a while, and you don't need to worry about getting your soil tested. If your soil is in a raised bed and it hasn't been tested in a number of years, maybe 5 years, it'd probably be worthwhile. But generally, if you started off with good soil, you're in pretty good shape, and the need for the soil test is probably less important. All right, so we have a question about our chicken manure fertilizer. It says, when exactly do you add the chicken manure? Like how soon before planting? So it depends on how you're going to put it down. There's different ways of putting it down. So one way is to broadcast it, which means just spread it out over the whole garden, over the whole bed. And if you're going to do that, it talks about putting 2 pounds down per 100 square feet. So you could just do that right before planting. And if you do that, then you could actually just rake it in lightly if you do that. You could also do it right before planting and put it as a side dress, which means as you plant the row of plants or seeds, you just make a little tiny furrow about 6 or 8 inches out from that row of plants or seeds and sprinkle some in that furrow. Or if maybe you're planting a tomato plant, you sprinkle a little bit around the outside of the tomato plant, not real close to it, but around the outside in a circle. And you can do that right before you plant. But you can also wait till later, especially if you're putting down seeds, wait till the plants are up and growing a little bit. Or if you put out tomato transplants, wait till they're growing. You can actually tell that they're starting to grow and put down your fertilizer at that point. And then again, if you're doing a crop again later for fall, you might want to add some more again later, like in July or August for fall crops. So question about walnut trees. And if you haven't heard this before, walnut trees can negatively impact a garden because the roots give off a toxic substance that will discourage plants from growing. So if you have a walnut tree, the question was 20 feet uphill from your garden, is that going to affect your soil in a negative way? And the answer is, it would depend how big the walnut tree. If it's a large tree, it could, but 20 feet is pretty far away. So unless it's a large tree, it probably would not be an effect. But even the leaves, if they fall on the garden or blow into the garden, that can cause a problem. So generally, we recommend people try to locate their gardens as far as possible away from walnut trees. Somebody had a question about horseweed and hogweed, and those terms have different meanings. So I'm going to ask that person to actually send me an email, just because that's a more complicated answer. But if you email me at ben@kccg.org, I can answer that question for you about your horseweed and hogweed. Somebody asked about crushed eggshells. Is it worth saving and adding to the soil? You're probably not going to get enough crushed eggshells to make a big difference. But if you had a compost pile, it's definitely worth adding, because that will just, it's a good way to dispose of those eggshells. They don't need to go in the landfill. And, they can be added to your soil. They'll add some calcium and magnesium and other good stuff. So yeah, if you do a compost pile, I would say do that. You do want to crush them up and mix them in as much as possible. Peat moss, is that a good source of compost material? It is a good source in the sense that it works. It also helps to lower the pH, but it's expensive to buy peat moss. You don't get very much. It would be so much cheaper just to buy like cotton burr compost in a bag as opposed to peat moss. If you're making a potting soil for a container, peat moss is a good material if you mix it in with perlite. And I would recommend it for container gardening, but not for a raised bed, because you would just have to buy so much and it would be so expensive. And just adding it to your garden plot, it just would not have much effect because you would not be able to buy enough to make a big difference. Okay, is there a way to get rid of creeping Charlie without ripping out my entire yard? That is a tough one. Creeping Charlie, if you're not familiar, it's a kind of a weedy ground cover type thing, and it does spread. So that is tough. Usually it's in really shady areas that it likes. you know, there probably isn't any really good way to get rid of it without starting over. So what some people will do is till up and plant grass seed and start over. So it's not very easy to deal with, unfortunately. Somebody had another question about compost that I recommended that comes in a bag. It's called cotton burr compost. That's BURR. Sometimes it's called cotton boll compost, BOLL. And again, that's what's left after they harvest the cotton, and then it's ground up and composted. It's a really nice material. You can usually get it again at garden centers, and we usually have it too. Right now we're out because lots of people have been buying it, but we'll have some more in later if you want to get some of that. Okay, next question also relates to that. It says, I was told that cotton burr compost is full of pesticides. And that is a good question. It could be if you buy a kind that is not from organic cotton. So the kind that we get is grown from organic cotton that hasn't had pesticides treating it. Because cotton, they do use a lot of pesticides. So depending on the brand you buy, it may or may not have pesticides in it. So that's why you want to get a good brand that is made from organic cotton. The other thing I've noticed more recently is that some companies have been adding wood chips and other materials to the cotton burr compost. So make sure when you buy it, read the ingredients that it's 100% cotton burr compost. And then real quick, just a little bit about wood chips before I close, because I didn't talk about them. Lots of times people get excited about adding mulch, wood chip mulch to their garden. And there's even some websites that talk a lot about it, where they say that, you know, a wood chip mulch is a really good thing for your garden. Will help keep weeds down. And I am not a big fan of wood chip mulches for vegetable gardens. Around fruit trees and berry bushes is a different thing, landscape shrubs, etc. But around vegetable gardens, I don't like it because it tends to steal the nitrogen out of the soil and can make your plants deficient, which is not good. The other thing is, if your garden's anywhere close to your house, it's also a good way to attract a lot of termites, which is not good for your house or your garden shed or whatever. And it also just is not that effective in keeping out weeds. So I really recommend not using wood chips, and not even bark chips or shredded bark. I really like the cotton burr compost because it does not have the negative effects that wood chips do. All right, so that is our presentation. Again, if you've missed some of our earlier workshops, they're available on our website. You can watch them whenever you want. We'll have more coming up, and we need to register for those. If you don't register, you can always watch them later. And also, if you're interested in getting a copy of just the PowerPoint, you can send an email to contact@kccg.org, and we can actually just email a copy of the PowerPoint to you if you just want to see the pictures again, and in case you didn't get a chance to take notes. So anyhow, thanks for watching. Appreciate it, and good luck to everyone with their gardens.
And I just wanted to add, Ben, I'm going to put a link to our virtual workshop page in case anybody has not seen that. I put it up earlier, but here it is again. It's in the chat. It's on our website, and a video recording of this presentation will be up within the next few days, as well as a downloadable PDF link, so you can get the PDF there as well. So that's all I have for now. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, that's a good point, Rob. So yeah, you don't actually need to email us to get a copy of the PDF. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.